very brief introductions because, frankly, you don't want to hear from us. I just want to say very briefly, so there are actually 4 entities that are sponsoring this this conference. This shows the collaboration and interdisciplinarity here at Duke. I want to make sure I get our names right. We have the Center for Innovation Policy that Artie and I run, the Duke Center on Law and Technology, the Duke Initiative for Science and Society, and the Rethinking Regulation Program at the Keenan Institute for Ethics. So Nita's from Science and Society, Jeff is from Law and Technology, John from the Keenan Institute. And the idea behind this, the idea behind the center that Artie and I run is the words to useful words ratio in policy debates is pretty lousy. The words to sincere words ratio, similarly pretty lousy. And so we're trying to change that a little bit by actually having useful conversations where people are not just on talking points. Again, that's the idea of our center. That's the idea of this program. That's all I want to say, because again, you all don't want to hear from me, and we can proceed down the line from here.
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be able to co-sponsor this. Nita Farahani, I'm the director of the Duke Initiative for Science and Society. One just quick note, besides being pleased to be able to co-sponsor this, we also have a big program we run at Science and Society called SciPol, which you can follow at scipol.org or scipol.duke.edu, which has Michael Kleiman, who's going to be speaking with us today, as a vertical lead of AI, where we're tracking policy developments in AI and robotics. And hoping to do exactly as Stuart said, which is to help advance the conversation in that space and others around science, science policy, and more broadly, the integration of science and society. Welcome and thank you.
Jeff Ward, direct the Duke Center on Law and Technology. Also teach a class here at the law school called Frontier AI and Robotics Law and Ethics. As part of that, have the benefit of integrating with people like Michael and Buzz and others and through these different networks. I think this is an example of how our different groups work together so frequently. And so I just wanted to say thank you so much for being here, and I'm really excited for today.
Hi, I'm Jonathan Weiner. I co-direct the Rethinking Regulation Program, which is a university-wide program based at the Keenan Institute for Ethics at Duke University. And there we work on a whole variety of regulatory analysis and policy and institutions questions, including notably trying to do better at incorporating learning into regulatory systems so that regulation is not only a one-time decision, but a process of sequential updating, incorporating new information, adaptive regulation, and that relates very closely to situations in which we think we're going to learn a lot about emerging technologies, emerging risks, and so we're really pleased to be part of this this conference today. Really delighted to welcome all of you, expecting to learn a lot today as well. And for 4 centers on the 4th of May, the main thing I want to say is may the 4th be with you. And now I'm going to hand off to my co-director of Rethinking Regulation, Professor Laurie Benier, who's going to moderate the first session.
So we're going to get up and move.
Oh, we're moving. Okay.
Yes. The panels will be
One of you
here.
can take my seat. We'll play musical chairs.
I will take your seat.
Oh no, there's gonna be a fight over Vince. I have a. That's not you.
And also, this is all being webcast, by the way, so
You can.
FYI.
Yeah, why don't you switch down one? There. Yeah, Carrie. We'll put Carrie here. Vince. It's almost like we know what we're doing.
Party. Do we have a hashtag?
As it.
The hashtag, well, we have multiple hashtags, I guess, but,
One right
would you
now.
like to create one?
Hashtag AI admin state, or I don't know. You gotta figure
Yeah,
it
why
out.
don't you do that?
Okay, give everybody a second. I'm only slightly worried that there would be people, I don't know who these people would be, who would miss the opening session and plan to be here at 9 for this. But I guess I'll miss the first few moments. All right, so I am Laurie Benier, together with Jonathan Weiner. I co-direct the Rethinking Regulation Program at the Keenan Institute for Ethics here at Duke, and I have a bunch of other titles that you don't care about. So Today, my job is to moderate this opening panel. We're very honored to have with us three experts on artificial intelligence and their potential use in law. First up, we are going to hear from Professor Ed Felten, who is the Robert E. Kahn Professor of Computer Science and Public Affairs at Princeton University and is the Director of the Center for Information Technology Policy there. And then we will hear from Carrie Coglianese, who's the Edward B. Shills Professor of Law and also Professor of Political Science at the University of Pennsylvania, where he is the Director of the Penn Program on Regulation. Is it the Pennsylvania program or this the Penn program? I wrote Penn here, but then I didn't know if I had abbreviated. Okay, and then
Not the pencil program.
it's not the pencil, no. And then to open our discussion with some thoughts, we will be joined by Vince Conazer, who is the Kimberly J. Jenkins University Professor of New Technologies, and who has a triple appointment in computer science, economics, and philosophy. So, without further ado, Professor Felten.
Okay, good morning, everybody. I'm very happy and honored to be able to kick this off. So I'd like to give a little bit of perspective from a computer scientist's point of view on what this AI thing is. And I'll come at the question of what the nature of AI is in two ways. First, I'll talk a little bit about the history of the field and how that informs the way people think about AI. And then I'll give some quick lessons from the past and recent, from the recent past in terms of what we can say about the operation of AI. And then finally, I'll have just a few thoughts about the question of explainability of the results of AI. The hope is that this will be valuable in both dimensions of this AI and regulation issue, both in terms of what administrative agencies can do to use AI, and also how the emergence of AI changes the work that administrative agencies have to do. Okay, so first a brief history, and I'll start here with the birth of the field. The field of AI really started with this paper in 1943 from McCulloch and Pitts. This was a logician and an electrical engineer getting together. And the key idea in their paper was that you could build mathematical structures which were inspired by the human brain, not copying or emulating the brain, but loosely inspired by the brain. And you could build those in such a way that they could do complex logical reasoning. So any operation of logic, which you could describe as a sort of logical equations, you could build out of these electrical units. And they built units like the ones shown over on the right, which I won't go into what they are, but relatively simple combinations of inputs to yield outputs. So this was kind of the birth of the field. Mathematical structures inspired by the brain, doing logical, complex reasoning. The second, I think, landmark early in the field is this paper by Alan Turing in 1950, which has one of the best first sentences of any paper ever. I propose to answer the question, can machines think? And Turing created what he called the imitation game, what we today call the Turing test, which is basically, can a machine successfully impersonate a person in what today we would call a chat room environment? And if a human judge can't tell the difference between the machine and a real person in a chat room, then we say that the machine has demonstrated intelligent behavior. So the key ideas here that have influenced the field coming down is first, that Turing defines intelligence in terms of behavior, not in terms of internal experience. He doesn't ask, does the machine have an experience of being conscious or reasoning or being intelligent? He doesn't ask, what is it like to be the machine? He simply asks, how does it behave, and does it behave like a person? And second, that the goal is to behave as a person would. So this idea became important over time, the idea that we're aiming at behavior rather than emulating or copying the way humans go about something. And what we see today, indeed, is that AI systems don't work the way that the human brain or human intelligence typically works. We simply aim at performance on task. All right, so fast forwarding through the next 50 years of history, we saw slow but steady progress. We saw these big waves of optimism and pessimism, which were mostly decoupled from the actual state of progress in the field. Progress in the field was more steady, but optimism and pessimism, these big public mood swings, continued through this period. And at the end of this period, around 2000, there were some major grand challenges that still remained. Problems around interpreting complex inputs like image and speech recognition, natural language processing problems like language translation or summarizing a document, playing complex games like Go or poker, safety critical control problems like driving a car. These things were all seen as fairly far in the future around 2000, that experts believed that they would get there, but it would probably take a long time. Now, starting maybe around 2010, you can debate when, there's been a big surge of progress and optimism in the field, which has led to human level or even better than human level performance on many of those grand challenges, to the surprise even of experts. And this is driven by several factors, by the availability of large data sets, by better algorithms to process those data sets, and by bigger, faster computers that were able to handle all of that. Those factors have come together to enable this surge of progress. Big tech companies are now investing very heavily in AI. There's a lot of popular interest. So that's where we are right now in the field. So let me now come at the question of what is the nature of AI in a different direction, by pointing to three particular lessons that I would argue have been learned in the building of systems and development up to now. So lesson number one is that AI has not been a single thing. It's instead been a set of different solutions for different tasks. And this is sometimes described in terms of a distinction between narrow AI and general AI. In narrow AI, you're focusing on solving a specific narrow task or problem, and you're developing task-specific solutions. That there is an AI bag of tricks, a set of known methods, and you combine those together along with some task-specific engineering to try to address a specific narrow task. And in that area, we've seen steady progress over the years, and that's where most of the excitement is in practice. General AI, on the other hand, is the idea of building a sort of general-purpose human-like brain, the machine brain of science fiction, that's usable for any cognitive task. It can adapt to any task or problem you give it, and it's what we deem ourselves to have. But in that area, there's been not nearly so much progress. There's some excitement, some hysteria in that area, but fundamentally, we are far from having anything like a general AI. So the AI that we have today and can expect in the near future is narrow AI. Okay. So some implications of that. One is that if we think about AI performance in comparison to human performance, that AI will surpass us on different cognitive tasks at different times, because AI is not a single thing, but it's a constellation of many things. And it might be hard to predict when a particular task becomes automatable. Okay. Lesson number two is that when AI is successful, it doesn't think like a person. If it's an intelligence, then it's kind of like an alien intelligence. So to illustrate this, let me show you some examples that state-of-the-art AI systems make. And I want to emphasize these are systems that perform at or above human level on tasks. So an image recognition system, given this image on the left, said that that was a picture of an Indian elephant. The one in the middle it classified as an assault rifle. So not mistakes we would make. The one on the right, this was a facial recognition algorithm that interpreted this photo as being a photo of the actress Milla Jovovich, and for reference, she actually looks like that. Not a mistake that most people would make. Okay, so what's going on here? What's going on here is that the AI systems here are falling victim to optical illusions, in effect. Optical illusions that affect them, but obviously don't affect us in the same way. There are similarly other types of images or faces which we will misrecognize, but the machine would think, if it could think, are child's play. So the mistakes are different. AI errors are not like human errors. For tasks that can be done in different styles, AI tends to have a different style than humans. What's easy for AI might be hard for us, and vice versa. And this means that effective human-machine teaming may be valuable because we have strengths and weaknesses that can complement each other, but also hard to get right because it's hard to team up with an alien. Lesson number three is that on many cognitive tasks, more engineering effort or more data translates into better performance. The downside of this is typically it requires a lot of engineering effort or data, a lot of work and investment to yield substantial improvement on an AI task. That's the downside, but the upside is that when you're willing to make that investment, it's surprising how often it does lead to improvement on task. And that means that in some respects, progress in AI is dependent on where and how people choose to invest in a significant way, not only on sort of the fundamental technical underlying landscape. Okay, so here's an example of how steady progress over time leads to improvement. This is a graph of the performance of computer chess programs over time from 1984 up until about the present. The y-axis here is ELO rating, which is the standard way of measuring the strength of play of a person or machine based on performance against other players. And the horizontal red dotted line is the best human player. So you see a research community making a lot of effort over time, leading to very steady progress over time, gradually approaching, and then going right past human performance. Steady effort over time leads to success. Okay. And one corollary of this is that machines are often worse than humans at learning from experience, but machines can have the benefit of more experience because you can gather a data set that reflects the equivalent of many human lifetimes of experience. A machine by having access to more experience than a person, can outperform a person. Okay, let me move on and just talk for just a minute about this issue or problem of explainability of AI results. People often say that one of the challenges with AI is that it's difficult to explain what it does. We need an explanation, lack an explanation. And I want to say a couple things about that, because I think that's an issue that often comes up in discussions like the one today. So what does that mean? One thing to note is that in some respects, AI systems are much more transparent compared to the other thing we use for making decisions, namely a human brain. The human brain is not that well understood. We can sort of look at the pieces under a microscope, but understanding how the behavior of those individual neurons combines holistically to yield the many and varied behaviors that we see from human brains, we don't really understand that. In many respects, we have more ability to understand both the detailed operation of an AI system and also how the parts fit together. So sort of under a microscope at the micro level, AI systems are more transparent than a brain. And this suggests that there may be an opportunity actually to have AI results be more explainable than human results. So the big question here is why then, given all of this, that the AI system may not be more complex inherently than a brain, and that its parts are more transparent than the parts of a brain, why do people complain so much about explainability of AI? And I would argue that when people complain about a lack of explainability, there are actually 4 different flavors of complaints they're making. There are 4 things they might be complaining about. And I think it's useful to tease them apart just a little bit. The first complaint is non-transparency. Here the issue is somebody has explanatory information, but they just decline to give it to you. This is not a new thing with AI. People having information, not wanting to give it to you, you wanting transparency. The second type of explanation is one based in complexity. That here, detailed explanatory information exists, but nobody has figured out a sort of simple and holistic and intuitive way of explaining the algorithm's behavior on the whole. In the same way that the behavior of the human brain or the behavior of an organism in a laboratory may mystify us, even though we can take it apart and look at all of its parts, this is something that can happen. But one of the common mistakes is to think this is always what people mean when they complain about explainability. And I actually think that's not the case. Many explainability results are something other than this. The third flavor is non-intuitiveness. In this case, the system discovered a rule that for making a decision which is statistically valid or predictive, and there's strong evidence of that. We even understand what the rule is so that we could apply it ourselves. But we just don't know why it works. And in this case, sometimes the problem is just that there's some fact about society or nature which we haven't discovered yet, or we don't yet understand. And the machine has locked on to some version of it. So this is a case where the machine may be, in some sense, smarter than us, and we just haven't caught up with it yet. So in the same way that we might not understand the behavior of a super intelligent alien, we might not understand this. And the final type of explainability complaint is actually a complaint about justification rather than explanation. That is, we understand, in this case, we understand how the system works, but we want a justification for why is that fair or reasonable. We want a public reason, as political scientists would say, rather than a causal explanation. We know that this factor and that factor combined according to a rule and got a result, but why is it fair to put a person behind bars or to deny a person credit because of this? That's an entirely separate question, and often when people ask for an explanation, that's really what they want. I think it's valuable to be able to pick apart these different notions of explainability so that we can focus more in a more detailed way on what it is that we want in a particular case. And that's all I have. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Next, we'll get back. It's important to set the norms for these things early. Okay, Carrie, you are up.
Thank you very much to all the many sponsors of this event for the opportunity to be here. I would like to say at the outset that although Lori said that the panel are experts in artificial intelligence, I'm here really on the administrative law side of the title for today's workshop. And I come to this subject as someone who is a casual observer of the power of machine learning algorithms and artificial intelligence in the private sector, where we all have tangible experiences of the power of Google search and Netflix and Amazon recommendations. We see the progress that Ed just talked about having taken place over the last decade or so with the development of autonomous vehicles. Yet I also realize that there's a great bit of social anxiety about the possibility of a real shift in labor demand for humans with the advent of and the further proliferation of artificial intelligence, about concerns about safety with respect to automobiles and autonomous vehicles. Lots of concerns about privacy related to the big data that are exploited in a lot of these applications. And also a general set of alarm bells about what all of this means for the future of society. And when we hear people talk about, like Stephen Hawking or Elon Musk, about AI, summoning the demons that will perhaps enslave us through computerized overlords, I can't help but thinking, as someone who studies government, that those kinds of concerns must presumably be the most salient and most pronounced if government starts to use artificial intelligence. And I think it's really with that concern that I wanted to explore, and I have done so with a joint paper by myself and David Lair, who's now a Yale Law student, called Regulating by Robot. We take up the possible concerns from the standpoint of administrative and to some extent constitutional law about the government's use of and reliance on artificial intelligence. And I think there's two aspects or characteristics of machine learning algorithms that make that application in the governmental sector particularly of concern. And one is the explainability sorts of issues that Ed just talked about. These are algorithms that learn themselves, they're not directed in the same way that conventional statistical analysis has been with human modeling, with at least causal inference in mind that might lead to some of the explanations and reasons we're used to having. So this black box nature, I think, of machine learning algorithms is one particular characteristic that maybe creates a little bit more concern in the governmental sphere. And the second characteristic is the possibility of automation and automated decision-making. We have a strong tradition, at least in the U.S., a conception of democracy as government of the people and by the people. And yet, if we can design systems where decision-making, governmental decision-making is automated, that seems to depart from that and raise these concerns about rule by computerized overlords even more salient. So what I want to talk about today is just some ways of thinking and approaching these developments of artificial intelligence from the standpoint of law, prevailing law in the U.S. It may change, of course, and particularly these remarks are aimed at federal agencies who might be reluctant to pursue opportunities to improve decision-making by relying on artificial intelligence, but are concerned about law. And if nothing else, I think that could be said about government lawyers is they are often the ones who are most resistant to change and innovation. And if we can think about clearly about what the legal issues are and see where the pitfalls are, then they can better advise their clients in the government to go forward. And I think at the bottom line, my view is cautiously optimistic, and certainly it will depend on how AI systems are actually designed and deployed, whether they're legal or not. But I think we have no insuperable barriers in the law today. So let me just organize my remarks first by talking about how machine learning might be applied in a way that fits into existing legal categories that are relevant and important for administrative law decision making. And then I'll get to examining machine learning under four major legal principles or doctrines that are relevant: the non-delegation doctrine, due process, anti-discrimination principles, and transparency principles. And then conclude with just a few thoughts about, despite what I think is a general green light on the legal front for federal agencies to go forward with the use of artificial intelligence, some things to think about the merits of it. Okay, so let me just present for what will be very familiar to administrative lawyers, but may not be for others, is a division of the world into two types of actions that government agencies can take. They, as a legal matter, can either engage in adjudication, which we would generally think of as individualized decision-making or judgments about particular individuals. And machine learning can be quite useful in this, and in some areas is already being used. The IRS, for example, is already taking advantage of machine learning to help identify which individual taxpayers to target with audits. One could imagine further applications across the federal government in a variety of areas. For example, this isn't being done yet, but instead of having clunky rules about who can pilot commercial aircraft, you could have machine learning algorithms predict the risks of individuals if they were to pilot airplanes. So that could be an example of an AI system applied for adjudications. Could we actually see machine learning also used on the other side, the second type of major action that administrative agencies can take, rules? Well, here I think it's going to be a little bit different. You'd have to integrate machine learning algorithms into maybe more of an agent-based modeling structure, but it might be possible. And here we are thinking, have to think a little bit more imaginatively, but there might be possible for rule systems to be developed such that they automatically actually select particular rules. It might be actually very advantageous in in areas that are highly complex or where high-speed decision-making might be valuable in terms of rulemaking. Now, these two, this division between adjudication and rulemaking is important because this is where the body of law actually operates, or how administrative law divides the world. But there's also another division that I think is important. In administrative law, there is a doctrine that says where agency actions are committed to discretion, or where there's no law to apply, then there's really no judicial review of what the agency does. And in many areas where machine learning might be applied, they are what I would call in this chart discretionary, in that sense, that they are committed to agency discretion by law. And that's the first column that you have on the left here, that it doesn't matter in this context whether machine learning algorithms are actually controlling decisions, whether they're black box. I don't think that's going to matter at all for these areas that are committed to agency discretion by law. And what's such an example of that? Enforcement. Supreme Court, in a decision called Heckler versus Cheney, has declared that agency choices about which entities, which regulated targets to pursue for enforcement actions is committed to agency discretion by law. Put that to a side then. I don't think that will matter. Then we look at those areas where there is law to apply, and then I think the more problematic areas for law will come into play the more that these systems are determinative of the decision making. Where they are just aids to human decision making, we're really not likely to see much by way of legal implications. So it's really in these the two gray areas on the far right in the middle columns at the bottom where we get into adjudicating by algorithm or regulating by robot. And we can imagine, again, for targeting inspections, right now the PHMSA in the Department of Transportation uses regression models to determine what pipelines to inspect, but possibly you could imagine in the future using machine learning algorithms to make those decisions, or even perhaps to create systems where the algorithm automatically shuts off particular valves, for example. When it comes to rulemaking by algorithm, here's maybe a bit of a banal example, but I think it's a great metaphor. The city of Los Angeles has installed sensors in all the streets in the city, and they operate the traffic signaling systems by a machine learning algorithm that is black box in nature, and for any driver on a particular road at a particular time, that red light or that green light is setting a rule. And if you can think about that as what an automated rulemaking system might be, that could be applied in a variety of areas. So let me get to what the legal issues might be with respect to full algorithmic adjudication or regulatory decision making. We have a principle that makes it unconstitutional for Congress to delegate legislative authority to administrative agencies without an intelligible principle. Might this then act as a bar to delegating to artificial intelligence systems? I think not likely. A delegation requires an intelligible principle, and algorithms are only going to function well if they have an intelligible objective function. This is one of these areas where I think the use of machine learning will actually get us more precision than we probably currently have. What about the delegation to essentially a private entity, which is not really looked upon favorably in our constitutional structure? This is delegating sometimes to maybe a consulting firm that's running these algorithms, but I think here it's still not likely to cause a problem, in part because the concerns that underlie the private non-delegation doctrine are concerns about conflict of interest and bias by delegating to a private entity, and the algorithm doesn't have that kind of conflict built into it. And they are ultimately subordinated to human officials who can decide not to use it in the end. Functionally, this is a lot like a measurement tool, and there's a very clear precedent for the Federal Communications Commission, for example, relying on Arbitron rating systems in its decision-making, and this is what a machine learning tool would likely be. We turn to due process concerns. Here we might conceive of replacing hearings in front of a human judge or decision maker with an algorithm. Is that a problematic? I think not likely here, because the test is a balancing one under Matthews v. Eldridge, where the courts are supposed to weigh the private interests at stake, the accuracy of the procedure, in this case it might be an algorithmic procedure, and the cost of that procedure. And I think on the last two grounds, which are really the ones that machine learning would affect, they'll do presumably better. If it can be shown that the algorithm is more accurate, and it presumably will be less costly probably than human decision making, it's likely to fare quite well on due process grounds. That said, there might be need for some kind of rulemaking to take place to approve and vet the algorithm itself, so that there is some oversight about the parameters and objective functions and the structure of the algorithm. What about anti-discrimination principles? At the federal level, this requires not only disparate treatment, but also discriminatory intent. And I think quite frankly, because of the black box nature and the automated nature, where it's creating some distance between the humans and the algorithm, that actually will make the use of machine learning algorithms probably clear through this legal principle, if not as easily, not more easily, maybe at least as easily. Because just using a variable in the data that may relate to what would otherwise be a suspect class does not necessarily amount to what is a suspect classification, which is what the current doctrine prohibits. And suspect classifications arise when a variable related to a suspect class is categorically used to advantage or disadvantage somebody based upon that trait. And it's not clear under the non-parametric nature of machine learning algorithms that that's the case, and it's not necessarily the case that there's any circumstantial evidence from intent here. Obviously, if there is clear animus in deciding to use an algorithm, that will be problematic. But absent that, I think federal agencies shouldn't be too worried on that front. Finally, the transparency grounds. I think Ed did a really nice job of explaining various different dimensions of transparency, and there might be concerns that, especially when algorithms are used to create new rules, that perhaps it won't satisfy the standard for reason giving that the courts demand under the Administrative Procedures Act, arbitrary and capricious standard. But I think that's also not likely to be a problem in most cases. It is true that the courts have demanded that the assumptions and methodologies behind complex mathematical and scientific work that agencies rely on be put forward. But it's also clear the Supreme Court in the Baltimore Gas and Electric case has said that when there's this kind of complex scientific or expert work involved, the court should be their most deferential. And I think it's possible to also see that there's FOIA exemptions that might come into play here that would act as barriers. There will, though, I think, be good practices that agencies should engage in particular, to avoid the kind of withholding of information that is available that Ed talked about. I think good practice would include ferreting that out. All right, so I think on these three major principles, machine learning should have generally speaking, again, with all the caveats of how it's being deployed, a green light for federal agencies to go forward and use it. Should they? That's ultimately, I think, the question is more than even the legal one. And I think on the legal front, there's reason to be optimistic. There should be certainly some safeguards and good analysis that stands behind the use of machine learning algorithms by government, but that's true for anything that government does. And government itself is algorithmic, either the algorithms that are operating in the human minds or the organizational and institutional algorithms that make up decision-making within governments. And I think the choice really is not one between some ideal with human decision-making in the current governmental process versus this foreign and untried use of machine learning, but really one between algorithms against algorithms. And if machine learning can do better in some cases, I think government agencies should try to pursue that. I'm cautiously optimistic. Thank you.
All right, Vince, it's your turn to kick us off.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me. I think Ed and Carrie have done an absolutely wonderful job of setting us up for this whole day. And also in my experience, there's never a shortage of questions or discussion in these kind of venues and this particular topic. So I'll try to get to this discussion quickly. I do have some comments I want to make. I've roughly divided them into two parts, also roughly corresponding to Ed and Carrie. First, I want to talk a little bit more about trying to give people some insight into what is really possible with today's AI and what isn't. So a little bit more technical. And then I'll talk a little bit about my thoughts on applying these ideas in government. So let me start with the first. So first I want to point out that AI and machine learning systems still have significant limitations. They are becoming very good at certain kinds of tasks. And what tends to characterize those tasks, I think, is that you see the same type of problem over and over again. It appears to you in kind of a standard representation, like it's cleanly formatted. And we have some kind of clear goal that we're pursuing, some objective function. Maybe somebody has labeled a lot of examples by hand and we try to imitate that. Those are the kinds of settings that AI and machine learning techniques are becoming really good at solving. But that still leaves out a lot of things as well, right? So in particular, kinds of things that AI systems are not yet good at, that we as humans are very good at, are things like having a broad understanding of the world, especially of our human world. And we're very good about thinking about social relations and these kind of things. That's still very hard for AI systems. Closely related, they typically don't have what we would call common sense reasoning. They don't have kind of out-of-the-box creativity, right? So AlphaGo is well beyond any human player, but it's never going to say, hey, if we change the rules of Go a little bit in this particular way, the game would actually be more fun. That is completely outside the scope of the kind of thing that it can currently do. So there are still some serious limitations. Of course, over time we might get there, right? And in fact, if you look at something like self-driving cars, I think that's a very interesting kind of boundary example that in some ways it's a very structured environment, but at the other end it's a little bit open-ended. So I think that's just about at the boundary of what AI techniques can do today and makes it a very interesting example. And of course, it's possible that we will make tremendous progress. So I think Ed emphasized the importance of kind of steady progress, and that's sometimes not visible because it's happening at scientific conferences that people don't see. And I think that's very true. At the same time, I think even those of us really working in AI can sometimes really be surprised by the progress that's happening in one particular area or another. Right? So the resurgence of neural networks, I think, was a huge surprise to many people. A little bit before AlphaGo also. If you remember Watson at Jeopardy, that was a huge surprise to me. I did not think that would be solved anywhere near that soon. And also, kind of like Ed said, it solved it in kind of a weird way that it made mistakes that you just really scratch your head about. And yet it was much better than human players. So it's possible that we will make tremendous progress. I think if we really manage to solve some of these problems of common sense reasoning and broad understanding of the world, then maybe really we are in this kind of Elon Musk territory and we need to worry about kind of the deeper philosophical problems of nature of consciousness and personhood over time and so on. And I don't think it's crazy to think about those things. I've done a little bit of work on those myself recently, but I don't think that's what we're talking about here. I think what we're talking about here is more today's AI, or what we can see on the horizon and how that will affect the administrative state. Even in the kinds of limited settings that I just talked about, where you see the same kind of problem over and over again, and it's cleanly formatted, even there are some pitfalls that people should be aware of. Right? One, so to get a little bit more technical, one thing that you might worry about is a shift in the distribution of instances that you see. So to give an example of that, suppose you're using a machine learning algorithm to help you with sentencing or for setting bail, which is already being done. Now, there might be something that systematically changes in the world, right? Maybe for some reason there are mass protests with violence, and because of that, a lot of people are being brought in. And it's likely that your machine learning system has no idea of this broader context of what's going on, and is going to keep making decisions in the exact same way. And that may not be what you want. As another example, Kerry mentioned this. He divided things into machine learning for adjudication, I think, and machine learning with simulations for things like economic policy. I saw an interesting talk the other day where people were trying to use Twitter data for getting a sense of what was happening in the economy. So there was a nice example there that if people are tweeting the word benefits, if the word benefits appears in their tweets, that tells you something about the state of the economy. Until the movie Friends with Benefits comes out, and then the signal is completely disturbed. Right? So that's another example. Also, the introduction of AI techniques or a machine learning classifier can sometimes cause that distributional shift as well. If we go back to the sentencing or determining bail problem that we were talking about before, suppose that one thing that you pick up on is that whether somebody attends a particular hearing is a very predictive signal of whether they will recidivate, then you might really start classifying people based on that. But if you do that and that becomes public knowledge, then maybe people will do a little bit better of a job of showing up. Right? So your signal, and that might be a good thing in and of itself, but that's not something that you might have predicted would happen. So I think one takeaway from all that is that when you decide to adopt some of these technologies in government, it's good to have expertise there that can tell you about these pitfalls and that you stay aware of these kinds of things. Okay, so let me shift a little bit to the other side of things. So generally, I agree with Kerry that there are a lot of opportunities for deploying these techniques in government that aren't being taken. And so in many cases, we probably need more AI in government, not less. And I've seen examples of this myself where people had what I thought was a very useful AI application that should be deployed in various governmental settings, but they had some trouble because nobody had a budget for that, right? It just wasn't, they didn't have a process for adopting this kind of technology. So that's one kind of problem. That being said, I do really think that there are potential concerns with applying AI in government, some of which there may not be in the private sector. For one, people often might not have an ability to opt out of the system, right? It's being deployed and you can't necessarily move somewhere else. Another concern is that AI might actually be used for various nefarious purposes, right? You can imagine AI could actually help you be more effective in gerrymandering. If you wanted to strategically understaff certain offices, certainly could help you with that. If you wanted to direct resources specifically towards your political supporters, it could help you with that. So I think with all those things, it's very important that we have transparency and explainability, also just to prevent those kinds of things. And the point has been made also that in many ways, these algorithms could be actually much more transparent than human beings could be. And I think that is true, and I think there's a lot of potential to actually have things be more transparent in that way. At the same time, there's still a significant risk also because of this other point that Ed made, that the kinds of mistakes that these systems make are very difficult for us to understand, right? So we've become very good at understanding other people's reasons for acting and the kinds of mistakes that they made because that has had huge survival value to us. These kind of examples that Ed showed where images are being misclassified. I'm also scratching my head. I have no idea why it's doing those things, right? And that's maybe why we need to put a little bit more emphasis on transparency and explainability there, just because to people it's usually not very transparent how these things work and what kind of mistakes they make. Good. And then I think in the limit, this is maybe not as much of a concern yet in in the US or in Europe, but AI could also help you establish a kind of surveillance state that would have no precedent in history whatsoever, right? And we don't really know what would happen as a result of that. So I think that's something at least to keep in mind.
Okay.
Those are all my thoughts.
Thank you. Thank you all for a great opening panel. Here's how this is going to work. I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative to ask the first question, and then we don't have name placards for everyone. So if you raise your hand if you have a question, I will write down some, descriptors here so that I can try to call on you in some reasonable order. But then when I do call on you, it's going to be difficult. The guy in the navy blue jacket,
Mila Jovovich.
Mila Jovovich. If you could just introduce yourselves, and then future moderators will perhaps have the benefit of experience and get to know a few more names. Okay, so. My question, I'm hoping it will actually tie together some of the stuff that Carrie and Ed talked about. So Carrie, you had a nice graphic up there. It was a 2x3 as opposed to your normal 2x2s, where you talked about discretionary decision making that the agencies have, and there is not judicial review for those. And you sort of thought that was an area where AI would not be with a legal issue, which I'm not a lawyer, so I will defer to you on that. But I do wonder if there's more concerns in that space about some of the ethical issues tied to explainability. So if you're using AI to make decisions about targeting enforcement activities or audits or things that affect individual entities of some kind, I think that, at least for me, there would be some concerns. Potentially, going back to Ed's 4 flavors of complaints about explainability, maybe on the transparency and complexity, but certainly on the justification, right? Can you explain to someone why that's fair or reasonable? And so when we hear about these use in the private sector, I feel like that's often the case. Like, people get denied a job for some mysterious reason because the background check is run and they don't understand, they don't know, there's a lack of transparency about what the algorithm is doing, and then there's a lack of justification for why that matters. And if we use that in a government setting to target particular actions, I think that the ethics of that seem to me somewhat questionable, even if the law is not.
Well, let me just say that there is, I think, anytime that a government agency would have evaluated a machine learning tool or artificial intelligence system and determined that it will, for example, keep more unsafe pilots off from behind or in the cockpits than we're currently doing, or whether we're doing, this is some research we've done at the Penn Program on Regulation, using publicly available EPA enforcement data, OSHA enforcement data, and publicly available financial data, being able to design a machine learning algorithm that does a better job than OSHA currently does of identifying workplaces that will have safety problems, and improve the efficiency of that targeting by about 30%. Anytime that sort of happens, I think you have a justification. Mm-hmm. The justification is it works. And I think government is largely pragmatic. We have goals that we want to develop. The city of Chicago is trying to deal with infestation of rats in the city, and they have developed a machine learning algorithm that tells them where to put rat bait around the city. Maybe this will be a point of controversy and we can discuss it, but from my vantage point, I think the citizens of the city of Chicago are better off with a black box algorithm if it's shown to reduce the number of rats by where they place than if they need any other explanation for that. And that's the type of decision making that I think is ripe for, and these are often very narrow applications where I agree, the causal kind of model, has to be well understood and not too dynamic. But where that's the case, there's tremendous value. The EPA has hundreds of thousands of new chemicals that are being developed every year. And they have responsibility for determining whether these are toxic or not, likely to be hazardous to human health. There's no way you can subject all of these chemicals to animal testing, for example. So they've developed a machine learning algorithm to try to identify which of these are more likely to be problematic. Do we really know why it works? You know, in the same sense that we might with a traditional multiple variate regression model where we can identify clear variables? No, I don't think EPA does that. But if it works, that's, it seems to me, both enough for the law and in many contexts will be plenty for the ethics.
Okay, yeah, Vince?
So I almost entirely agree with Carrie. I think so when you're talking about things like, you know, which chemicals or, you know, where is there going to be a rat infestation, I think those are probably fine. I think when you're making judgments about people, it often changes things. Right? So one of my colleagues has this example that one good predictor of how well somebody succeeds in college is how many books are in their parents' home. But it seems to us insane to use that as a criterion for admitting people into college because we're also thinking about the incentives that they face, right? We want to reward students for having done a good job in high school. We realize that if we really, you know, it becomes public knowledge that this is how we're making our decisions, everybody's just going to buy a bunch of books that they don't read.
They have to afford it. Yeah.
If they can afford it, exactly.
They won't eat as much, but they'll have these books on their shelves, right?
Right.
You know.
So I think those, if you ask me to try to put my finger on which kind of examples make people uncomfortable, it's not the ones where we're making judgments about which chemicals are likely to be problematic or other kind of physical or you know, non-human judgments. But when we think about making decisions about people, often there's more going into that than just trying to classify correctly. And I think that's where people often get a little bit concerned.
And if I may, I am largely in agreement with that. I think that, and this, quite frankly, is not so much a legal limitation for the application of machine learning in government, but I think it's a social one. I think the example you gave about, say, college admission, for example, that's one where we actually have multiple objectives. And we haven't, as a society, really sorted out what the priorities and trade-offs ought to be on those multiple objectives. And one thing that law has done to make something, again, it's a pragmatic adaptation of a legal system. We have accepted what Cass Sunstein calls incompletely theorized agreements. And the law, for example, comes up with all sorts of loosey-goosey language about reasonable accommodations. Why? Because we really, as a society, haven't sorted out with a great precision. So I think that's a limiting factor. That's going to be very much a limiting factor if we can't really specify in a way that where there's clear social consensus what that objective function ought to look like. Then that's going to limit it.
So often when you apply machine learning to settings like this, what the learning algorithm is fundamentally doing is trying to make a prediction, right? It's trying to predict something. And you can ask first, is it predicting that accurately? So in the case of placing rat poison, are you correctly predicting that placing that in a particular place will be effective at getting rid of the rats? Or maybe you're trying to predict what would a human expert do in a particular setting. So there are really two questions to ask in that kind of a setting. One is the prediction accurate? And that's sort of a statistical question. The other is, even if we could predict that thing perfectly accurately, would that be a good reason to support the decision that we're making? Right? In some cases, for example, if we're trying to predict the decision of a particular human decision maker or a set of human decision makers. Is it enough? Would that be enough? Would that be reason enough? The thing we're trying to predict, if it were true, would that be reason enough to do what we want to do? And sometimes it might not be.
Great. Okay, I open it up to the floor. I got you too. All right.
Nicholson Price, University of Michigan. Does it matter that the errors that we're going to see are weird errors? Right? So, Vince and Ed, you both mentioned this idea that the mistakes machine learning makes are not like the mistakes that we make, and so one might think to the extent that we value an error correction role in the administrative state, in the courts, that these are going to be errors that are not the errors that we're looking for, or not the errors that we know to expect and know how to correct, because instead we'll be seeing, the Mila Jovovich is this random dude, as opposed to, oh, here's an instance where I might expect to see bias on on a human decision maker, or might not have taken this into account. Like, does the type of error matter?
I think that's right. I think sometimes we have systems in place to catch errors that we think we're likely to make, and they may not catch the kinds of errors that these systems would make. I think that is a real concern. Of course, if you have both a person and an algorithm try to classify this case and you find that they disagree, then we know that something is up. So in that way, you might actually get more robustness, right? We can try to catch human errors with machine learning or vice versa, and that might give some robustness to that. But I think, yeah, that is a real concern.
So certainly trying to minimize the number of errors, trying to understand, categorize, and prevent specific types of errors is valuable. But there's another aspect to this as well, which is that if we ask a system to minimize the total error across a population, sometimes the way to minimize total error is to push a lot of the error into some specific group. Maybe if we make a bunch of errors over here, we can, within a small subpopulation, we can reduce the number of errors we make across across the rest of the population in a way that reduces the total number. A good example of this is some experience with algorithms that try to determine whether a person signing up for a service is giving their real name versus fake names. And those algorithms have tendencies to misclassify real names as false within groups that have unusual naming practices. So, for example, Native Americans sometimes have different types of names, a name in which the last name is more than one word from the dictionary. That's a pretty good rule across the population as a whole for detecting fake names. But for that subpopulation, it's a bad rule. And so if we're not careful, we could have systems that tend to concentrate the errors in subpopulations in a way that is troubling from a policy standpoint.
Can I also add, there's also the possibility of errors being distributed, not concentrated, but diffused in ways that might be problematic. So let's take with autonomous vehicles, let's suppose that in the aggregate we can get the number of automobile fatalities down significantly in society, and let's suppose that the algorithms may ensure that this is distributed fairly randomly across society. Well, that may be problematic because right now we have, I think, pretty much a bimodal distribution of who dies in automobile accidents. It's usually very young drivers who are driving poorly and very old drivers driving poorly. What does it mean for society now if we can't really explain why the people who die are dying or getting in auto accidents? Because, in the same intuitive way that we can right now, saying, no, they're young and inexperienced, or they're old and maybe
Shouldn't be driving.
incompetent. So
if we have errors if we have goals beyond just minimizing the total number of errors, we can, of course, incorporate that into the process. But we need to actually think about those things and learn from experience in order to figure out how to do that.
And then we get back to Carrie's point that sometimes those things are very difficult to make precise, right?
Yep.
And we would love to have that for our algorithm, but it's not there.
Pate.
Yeah, Pate Skeen from Neurobiology. This actually follows up on that question of types of errors. So I'm curious if actually any of you, maybe beginning with Carrie, could comment on the sort of algorithm human decision maker interface. And what I'm thinking is that what is the information that a human decision maker really needs in order to make a proper decision based on an algorithm? That's sort of a technical question, that is what do the AI people tell the human decision makers, and it's both a legal or regulator or agency question. What do I need to accept the algorithm, and what do I do with that algorithm? So what I'm thinking is, for example, if you tell me that there's a certain overall improvement in efficiency for baiting rats in Chicago, I'm not really concerned if I get the right rats or the wrong rats get killed by mistake. I'm really concerned if the wrong person gets sent to prison or deported or denied some kind of permit. So I guess the sort of question, could you comment a bit on, is it sort of should courts, say, reviewing an agency action, be saying, well, it's a sufficient justification that it's more efficient, or you need to make a certain kind of inquiry about the kind of objectives or the kind of errors? Maybe you could just comment a little bit on that sort of legal review of the human decision maker.
I think in general, there's a good bit of deference that the courts have given across the board, and especially when there gets to be very complex scientific decision making. The Supreme Court in the Baltimore Gas and Electric case made that kind of clear. That should be where the courts are the most deferential. That said, I think it's also fair to say that there's always some uncertainty about how, this would be an interesting algorithmic exercise, how will courts actually review things under the arbitrary and capricious doctrine? For example, you will see certainly people making arguments that they've left out important considerations. And I think the best advice for agencies would be to try to consider that presumably those kind of concerns should be surfaced during the comment process if this is being used during a rulemaking procedure, for example, and address it. But addressing it doesn't necessarily. I don't think the courts have ever demanded that agencies lock down everything with great precision. In fact, I think we have so many areas in the law where we have these incompletely theorized agreements, and the courts have been largely pragmatic in accepting that.
Okay, I have.
Jonathan was trying to jump in, but get on the queue.
All right.
Okay.
Well, I have a lot of people in the queue, so what I'm going to suggest, and I'm writing. You got to see my notes here. It's hilarious. Man in blue shirt next to blonde woman. Okay, so I'm going to suggest that we collect a couple of questions, and then we're responsible to collect a couple of questions, and otherwise I'm afraid we're not going to get through everybody's questions. So next up in the back corner there, man in blue shirt. They're all men in blue shirts. Yeah.
I'm David Banks. I'm the Director of the Statistical and Applied Mathematical Sciences Institute. Nearly all the expert systems used by the government are developed by contractors and are protected by proprietary information. And so I wonder if in that context it's possible to have this fairness and transparency that we want to achieve.
Thank you. Okay, Stuart.
So maybe this relates to that a little bit. It might be that we'll actually have enhanced transparency in a couple of important ways. So right now, we often defer to decision makers who give us no information about the basis upon which they decide things, or all they're required to do is say, "I had a hunch." We actually have a bigger problem, which is sometimes the decision makers we have reason to believe are lying. So the classic example is, it just so happens that all of the potential African-American in the juror pool, I knocked out for reasons that were unrelated to race, right? And so it might actually be, if we can overcome David's good point, if we can do any interrogation of the system, that will have greater rather than less transparency about how decisions get made.
Any other questions on that? Transparency? Yeah. Oh my goodness, so many. All right. All right. Yeah, Marjorie's next in the queue, actually. But let me just get Buzz and the gentleman in the blue if this is on a related point, and then there's a woman in the back also, and then we're going to have them answer, and then we're going to go to Marjorie. Yeah.
I'm wondering whether, Buzz Waitskin from Science and Society here at Duke, I'm wondering whether we won't end up adopting effectively an exclusionary rule that extracts information from the decision-making process that we know is accurate, but for reasons external to the system, we decide we're not going to include them. So for example, in the criminal justice system, we exclude what we know is very pertinent information because it was seized improperly in some fashion. So even though we know the person had the murder weapon, that doesn't get introduced into the system. You can envision situations, for example, with bail decisions or sentencing decisions that we decide race is a very important predictor, but we're not going to allow race to be integrated into the system for social reasons. So won't we end up ultimately with a distorted system that will have less accurate results because we've excluded categories of information for reasons external to the accuracy of the system?
Okay, and then the last.
Sure. David, Elon Law and Stanford Center for Humane Society. Terrific panel. Thank you, Duke, for hosting this. Very quickly, given the time, a couple of comments. First, jumping off the point that was made earlier, I mean, trade secrecy, example, is by far the most powerful access control doctrine within this area, and is often and usually impermeable by courts precisely because they lack the expertise to interrogate, right, those that claim proprietary classifications over this information. So I'm not sure how much we can make of discretion in the courts or even in regulatory systems given the impermeability of trade secrets combined with the lack of expertise as previously mentioned. The second point is that Barocas himself and others have written about discrimination written into algorithms by virtue of human beings writing. And I'm not quite sure how we can disaggregate that, although this panel and the expertise there would give us the best answer we might come up with. The last point quickly is just the broader theory of reason-giving and democratic accountability, and whether that pushes against the broader concern, which seems to focus more on the harms associated with bad decisions, and whether there is a basis theoretically to simply say, by virtue of the lack of understanding of these algorithms and AI, it requires from democratic theory more explainability, regardless of the harms associated with bad decisions.
Okay, and the woman in the back, did you have a related question on this? Yes.
Yeah, this is Tia Stewart. I'm from North Carolina Central. My background is in healthcare nursing, and I can remember using computer-based algorithms 2000 in the healthcare sphere. Most of the insurance denials or length of admissions, how long you got to stay, were based on proprietary computer algorithms. So we had to make changes due to lawsuits. I can remember hospitals saying, well, how did you guys make the decision? There was no information that was released. So we had to incorporate variances, outliers, and later on, as things progressed, we use clinical pathways. We had to integrate metrics, and how we got more transparency was the software companies actually sold a conversion to the hospital. And I don't think people realize that when you go into the hospital, there's a healthcare usually nurse that's running your data and sending things on the insurance side, but there's also somebody on the hospital side that's running that. And that was the only way that we got any type of transparency. And there still isn't, but the hospitals know it's not that health insurance. So do you think there'll be that same type of progression in integrating metrics and algorithms and other things to
Okay, great sets of questions about transparency and fairness and proprietary data. So I'm going to let you guys, proprietary algorithms, I'm going to let you guys take a crack at these, and then if I feel like something didn't get answered, I'll nudge you again. Yeah, Ed.
So on this issue of trade secrecy or proprietary data, really, I think there's a responsibility of a government agency to deal with this in the contracting procurement process. That if an agency has a responsibility or a need to be able to be accountable, to be able to interrogate a system or provide information to the public, they need to insist on that as part of the procurement of that technology or the licensing of it. And if you do that, then they will be in a position to provide the information that they need. Now, too often they don't. And you get locked into the situation where there is a powerful trade secret claim that can be made as a barrier to accountability And but that need not be the case. And I think there's not enough attention paid to making sure that those procurements are done in the right way and making sure that you have the right kind of expertise, both from the standpoint of understanding the technical aspects of accountability, but also kind of the legal and administrative aspects of it. I think there's no other way around it other than government insisting up front that if we're going to buy this for this purpose, you, the trade secret holder, are going to need to be willing to allow at least so much transparency, or maybe construct your system in a way that provides access to enough information that we can answer these questions from the public and the courts. And we can satisfy ourselves that we are carrying out our responsibilities to the public responsibility.
Yeah, Vince, go ahead.
I think my notes are starting to look like Lori's. So I completely agree with what Ed just said. I think to try to answer a bunch of questions all at the same time, I think one thing to keep in mind is that the first deployment of these systems is probably not going to get everything completely right? And I think sometimes only after we deploy it will we realize that there's problems with the system. Of course, if we can catch them ahead of time, all the better. But sometimes we only realize afterwards that, hey, it's taking improper seizure into account that really shouldn't, right? And so we want to be able to update the system. So we want to be able to understand the system, and we want to periodically reevaluate whether it's missing something that we care about. Sometimes we will not be able to predict the kind of effects that it will have, right? I think probably nobody working on social media early on would have predicted that it would lead to polarization in society, right? Maybe only find out after the fact. And so we need to put ourselves in a situation that we can analyze and then update these systems, update what our criteria are for these systems, what we want to see out of them, and continue to aim higher.
I think first I would obviously Vince would be better equipped to answer the question about the exclusionary rule, but I think you're exactly right that if you start taking some data out, you may end up with it, because we don't know exactly how different data and variables interact in a machine learning algorithmic setting, that you may end up actually getting things worse for some of the people who you're trying to protect by taking, say, race sometimes out of the data set. But with respect to the larger questions about transparency, I think it's absolutely right that there's trade secret protection under the Federal Freedom of Information Act. And I mean, to some extent, in the framing of my inquiry, that should make it all the easier for federal government agencies to deploy this, because they are, they have already the legal protection for hiring contractors and who want to have protected trade secrets. That's a different question, of course, and I recognize that, than what really should we do. And I recommend, David Lair and I recommend, best practices would be to actually follow something like what Ed is saying, design this up front so that there will be some disclosure. But I don't think that's necessary. And I think it's important, maybe in this context of transparency with respect to government, to understand that administrative law has for many years made clear that the goal of the courts, when they are reviewing agency action and looking at the reasons for that agency action, is not, and there's actually Supreme Court doctrine that says, not to peer into the mind of the administrator. This is not an exercise of finding out exactly why it really did happen, but rather of demanding that agencies put forward a reason for it. And I think it's possible, even with respect to deployment of AI systems where the government's relying on private contractors and there's trade secret protection, to demand that agencies nevertheless explain, for example, how they validated the system. So we can't give you a lot of information about how the algorithm's structured, perhaps, but nevertheless, here are the steps that we took to make sure that on these objectives, we actually found an improvement. And that would be a sufficient justification under current law. we can have a discussion all day about whether current law should change, and I'm happy to have that discussion, and also should flag for people that discussion is taking place. New York City Council has had legislation introduced that would actually require the disclosure of a variety of model structures, assumptions, test data outputs, and so forth for algorithmic applications by at least by the New York City government. It's not law yet, but I think we're likely to see more of that going forward.
Okay,
I can just add one tiny thing to that. Well, it's certainly right that complete transparency about everything is not necessary, but it's still often the case, if you're not careful, that an agency won't even get enough access or information to do what you were saying they should do. And it's really important to make sure up front that they will be in a position to justify and provide justification.
Would agree. Okay, we're going to take the last set of questions here, starting with Marjorie.
Hi. So I also had a version of the transparency discussion to follow up on, and it was the point about deferring to expertise. In a previous position, I had a project on how to get more science into forensic science, and I learned that a lot of experts who testify aren't really so expert. So in this time of AI mania, I know that Ed Felton is an expert because I followed his work for many years. But there are lots of people who realize this is the hot thing, and they're going to call themselves experts. So what does the law do to get at expertise that's real when it matters?
Okay, thank you. In the back on the computer. See? You knew who I was talking about. Great, thank you. Yes, you. The blue shirt next to the blonde woman, that's what I literally wrote down.
Ken Hodgerson from the Salem School of Public Policy across the street. Even though, Carrie, even though you said that courts don't look into administrators' minds, I wondered if you might. And I'm interested in the political will. If you see political will to either adopt AI in usage, encourage it, and even mandate it, I guess there's a range of options that are possible, and I guess speaking to that, what is the political will, either on the legislative side or in the agency executive side, if any, or are we just speaking as if we'd like to see things happen that may or may not happen?
And Jonathan, you get the last question.
I just wanted to add a little word. I very much appreciated the panel and all of the discussion, but a little bit of pushback against the Supreme Court's Baltimore gas decision, which did say, back in the early 1980s, 1980, I think, right, that the courts would defer to the agency when the agency was at the frontiers of science. But that was a case, I think, where the agency was transparent, but taking Ed's distinction, it was transparent about the information it was using, but lacked justification. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission was saying, we will assume that nuclear waste stored in the yet-to-be-constructed federal repository will have a probability of 0 of leaking out of that repository. And the Supreme Court said, oh, that's at the frontiers of science. We defer to the agency. And I think the history since then is that the courts have rarely been so deferential on all sorts of other scientific questions. So, Daubert and many other versions of judicial review of science since then, Chlorine Chemistry Council, DC Circuit decision, there are lots of cases where the courts can ask for agencies to justify the reasoning for a scientific inference.
Okay, so just to sum up, we've got questions about expertise. How do we really know, other than you guys, that they're experts? Sort of related to that, it's not going to be enough to just be a good scientist. You're going to have to actually be able to communicate this, and how are we thinking about that? And then questions about the political will, and then, Carrie, if you've got a minute, you could respond to Jonathan's pushback on here. So there, you've all got 2 minutes to do that, so let's...
Well, I can follow up. First, As I indicated, I think there's certainly a good bit of uncertainty about what courts will always demand, Baltimore Gas and Electric notwithstanding. However, if you look at, and I have, and I'm happy to separately send over sites, I don't have them committed to memory, but if you look at court decisions over time dealing with complex mathematical algorithms, even there aren't cases really yet about agencies relying on machine learning algorithms, but the complex mathematical algorithms, they are citing Baltimore Gas and Electric, and they are deferring. I think the kind of frontier environment that you talked about, and I think you're accurate that Baltimore Gas and Electric is I think very analogous to this context where we have this black box nature of what the algorithm's doing. Let me just add one thought also on the political will. I don't think we have it. I don't think there is a lot of political pressure to do this right now. The GAO tells us that 75% of the IT budgets in the federal government are devoted just to maintaining legacy systems. We would need to do this well at the federal level, a commitment of resources, both budgetary and human capacity. Now, I think, ironically, the need for relying on machine learning algorithms might be even greater under periods of governmental austerity, right? Because I think, and that may be what flips eventually, and when people start to realize, look at what the private sector is able to do and how they're able to save so many costs, that maybe that will drive this at least the federal government. I think there's a lot of innovation and drive at the local government levels, because they are under conditions of austerity, and they also have more immediate pressures from their citizens to get those potholes filled or get the rat problem addressed. And that's where I think we're seeing today a lot more innovation in the machine learning context.
Ed or Vince on the expertise and the need to be able to communicate questions?
I'm going to say a little something about that. It is a real issue in both respects, to both of these questions. And I think in the long run, there's a couple things that make me hopeful about this area. One is that I think it's possible for the community of true experts to engage in the political process and in the policy debate in a way that is more sophisticated and strategic. And the climate scientists didn't always do that as well as they could have. That's a longer conversation for the break, perhaps. The other thing that makes me hopeful is generational change. If you go into policy circles, what you find is many of the younger people who are coming up through staff positions do have more background, more of an intuitive feel for these sorts of topics. You know, they aren't all experts themselves, but they are expert adjacent, and that makes a huge difference. They know how to talk to experts. They have a better time understanding who is expert, and so on. And I think as that generation matures into more senior leadership roles, we'll see improvement just because of that.
Anything to add?
So I think that's exactly right. I think we are seeing more people from AI and machine learning taking part in these debates and educating themselves on it as well. That being said, I think even for young people, even for our students today, right, if you're going through a computer science program, you don't necessarily learn anything about how to communicate about these kinds of things, or more expertise on the other side. And similarly, I think most of our young lawyers don't learn much technical in the way of computer science, AI, and machine learning. Of course, there are people who make a good effort at that, like Jeff over there, but it's still very limited. So I think there is a need for more people, not necessarily everybody. I think that it still makes sense that some people, if that's what they want, that they just receive a very straight computer science education. But I think there is a need for more people to be trained in a more interdisciplinary way to be able to address these kinds of topics.
Terrific. Thank you all for an excellent conversation, and thanks to the panel today.